new day for America and a new dawn for peace and freedom in the world.
There's no figure more celebrated in the work he did for civil rights than Martin Luther King Jr. His death on April 4th, 1968, due to an assassin's bullet, left the nation, and especially the Black community, hopeless.
With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. first made waves by assembling the 1955 Montgomery Bus Boycotts, which were put together after Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to move further back on the bus for a white passenger. At the time, Jim Crow laws prevented African Americans to be hired as drivers, were forced to enter and ride in the back of the bus, and ordered to give up their seats for white passengers. This campaign lasted for a year until the United States Supreme Court deemed Alabama and Montgomery bus laws unconstitutional. The next set of protests were the sit-ins of the early 1960s. Organized by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, in which King was newly named the president. The SCLC and other Black civilians of Birmingham, Alabama began to occupy public spaces, hold peaceful marches, and sit at white lunch counters to protest the unjust laws of the South. Most times, participants were pelted with food and had to endure beatings by sitting at the all-white lunch counters. If any students were to retaliate, it would undermine the entire protest. Progress on civil rights was moving at a snail's pace, but the divide between races was gradually crumbling. After establishing a working relationship with both the President John F. Kennedy and the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, King helped organize the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin originally brought up the idea for a march on the nation's capital in 1961. After no signs from the White House of progress on civil rights that were promised in 1960, and plenty of time to plan for this massive event, the march was put in place. On August 28, 1963, 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by Abraham Lincoln, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom took place. Including speeches from John Lewis and Whitney Young, over 200,000 people showed up from all over the country to march from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. The most memorable speaker of the day was, of course, Dr. King, who delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, in which he called for the end of racism.
Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedoms led to President Kennedy addressing the nation on civil rights and put a plan in place to get a civil rights bill passed. By 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed under the Johnson administration. King won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 for his work combating racial inequality while doing so in a non-violent way. In 1965, he began organizing the Selma voting rights movement. The Selma to Montgomery marches were 3 protest marches held in 1965 along the over 50-mile stretch of highway from Selma, Alabama to the state capital of Montgomery. The marches were meant to be nonviolent protests to demonstrate the desire of African American citizens to exercise their right to vote. The first of the marches took place in March 1965 when state troopers attacked demonstrators with tear gas and billy clubs as they crossed the county line. The bloodshed led to an outcry from civil rights leaders and many across the nation for allowing something like this to happen. The Selma voting rights movement would pave the way for the passage of the Voting Rights Act later that year. By 1968, King, along with the rest of the nation, had moved their focus towards ending the Vietnam War. Passionate that the unnecessary violence happening in Southeast Asia needed to be stopped, he addressed the president multiple times about the war. On March 29, 1968, King visited Memphis, Tennessee in support of the Black sanitary public works employees that had been on strike since March 12th for higher wages and equal opportunity. On April 3rd, King addressed a crowd and delivered his infamous "I've been to the Mountaintop" speech. In the last speech he would ever give, King would say,
"But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
At 6:01 p.m. on April 4th, King was fatally shot by James Earl Ray as he stood on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel. King died at 7:05 p.m. at the age of 39 years old. Multiple riots broke out in almost every major city across the United States after the news broke of King's death. Robert Kennedy, campaigning for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination at the time, was in Indianapolis the night Dr. King was shot and killed. He proceeded to make one of the greatest and most heartfelt speeches ever given.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand compassion and love.
Over 100 cities across the United States burned that night. Indianapolis was not one of them. A sense of mourning was draped across the country, one that felt as deep as it did in 1963 with the death of President Kennedy. King's legacy continues to live on. He is a hailed figure from the 20th century, and rightly so. Despite 50 years since his death, civil rights have had many major accomplishments, but there is still enormous room to grow. Police brutality towards innocent black civilians took center stage in 2013 with the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. With the way the current administration has governed, where bigotry and hatred reign supreme, it's time to take a page from King's book and
to the people of America and the nations of the world that we are not about to turn around. Yes, sir. We are on the move now. Yes, sir. Yes, we are on the move, and no wave of racism can stop us. Yes, sir.
It must be tempered with a solid realism, and I think the realistic fact is that we still have a long, long way to go